get started with the Vinimark webinar titled Biodynamics, Organics, and the World of Natural Wine. So the context to this webinar is that I think it's safe to say in the broadest of brushstrokes that consumers, at least in the Western world, have spent the last few decades slowly waking up to this need for sustainability, whether we're talking about food or clothing or energy or architecture. We've kind of realized as humans that our well-being is pretty strongly linked to the well-being of the planet on which we live. You thought it would have happened sooner, but we're finally catching up. Now, in the wine industry specifically, this growing consumer awareness has played itself out in a number of different ways, both in the demands of the consumers we were talking about, but also in the practices of the producers. Now, to solve the problems that we're facing, it would be super peachy if we could just, get rid of all ethical and practical conundrums by unilaterally declaring that everyone must do the right thing. But the problem is that it's sometimes very difficult to know what the right thing is. So today, hopefully, in this webinar, we'll be able to untangle these kind of crazy webs of farming ideals and practices, industry certifications, marketing jargon, winemaking definitions, and the occasional article of hocus pocus, so that we can make sense of it all. And to help us do that, we've gathered an amazing panel, but I'll tell you about them in a bit. First of all, you guys need to know that there are two audiences in the webinar today, and you might fall into one of two camps. Either you're going to be a more scientifically minded or philosophically minded producer, or even passionate consumer who's set your mind to understanding these concepts. And I hope today will really open this up for you. But the second group is perhaps for producers who have already understood these concepts and realized their importance. And perhaps you're looking to find out how you can transform your operations and your businesses in order to better conform to the certifications that are out there. So as I said, our panel today is super exciting. First up, we've got Christina Rasmussen, who is a London-based wine writer. She's the co-founder of Little Wine, it's an online content platform, but it's also a wine club and a bottle shop. And what they do is connect or bridge the gap between the winemakers and the consumers. And their special focus is appropriately biodynamic wines, natural wines, and organics. Then we have Rüdiger Gretschel, who is a winemaker, an eternal optimist. He's a self-proclaimed wine geek, and he's also the head of production for Vinimark. And then we have his partner in crime occasionally, Johan Reinecker. Johan's more of a kind of warrior, philosopher, poet, but when he's not doing all that, he is also the cellar owner and viticulturalist at Reinecker Wines. Then we've got Jamie Good, who is a scientist. He's an author, he's a wine journalist. He is the brain behind books like Wine Science, the Application of Science in Winemaking, and also Flawless, which is a combination of philosophy and science on flaws in wine. And finally, we have David Clarke, who is the founder of Ex Animo Wine Distributors. And I think he's a pioneer in the movement. He hates the word pioneer and doesn't want it applied to him, but the work that he's done in promoting biodynamic and organic producers is incredible. He represents people like Craig Hawken, Mick Craven, Bernard Bredell, Johan Stompie Meyer, Trizan Barnard, and Lucas van Logrenberg. So that is the panel, super exciting. Rüdiger, I wonder if you could open up the chat for us today. I mean, you're one of the driving forces behind this whole webinar. So I thought I'd start out by getting you to clear up three of the terms that we're going to be using a lot today, I hope. Now, Isabelle Legeron, the Master of Wine, has written a fantastic book called Natural Wine, An Introduction to Organic and Biodynamic Wines Made Naturally. So I thought the title of this book, which everyone should read, by the way, is a great starting point. So if you could give us a sort of verbal Venn diagram, if that's a thing, to tell us about where biodynamics, where organics, and where natural wine are all different to one another, and also perhaps where they overlap.
Oh, sure. Thanks, John. I'll try. I think obviously the idea of organic and biodynamic are certain ways of agriculture. So the concept is pretty simple. Organic agriculture, the idea is that you are farming essentially sustainable. So the idea is that you don't have any chemical herbicides or pesticides. You farm without any GMOs, and you don't want to use any synthetic fertilizers to kind of get your crop to grow. So the idea is very much you use biological or ecologically kind of based pest controls, biological fertilizers, which are mostly derived then from animals or plant wastes, or cover crops that have the ability to bind atmospheric nitrogen. So in essence, it's a holistic way of farming agriculturally. Biodynamics probably takes it one step further. Here, Johan always explains it very nicely, where you try to move away from sustainability and more into this concept of self-sufficiency. So to give you an idea, you would like to think your farm as a closed entity. You don't want to really bring anything on the farm, so you have to start working a lot more holistical. You start moving away more from this concept of monocultures, and you need to farm very much in this closed realm. Rudolf Steiner initially came up with this concept of biodynamics probably about 100 years ago, just after the First World War, when the first kind of fossil fuel-based chemicals and fertilizers came onto the world stage, and a lot of farmers were just concerned about the usage of these, and they asked the philosopher Steiner to kind of give his idea of agriculture, and out of this concept of biodynamic agriculture was born. Mario Thun did most of the practical work behind it, but the founding concept of it is essentially based on these four values, if you like. One of them is this idea of self-sufficiency. The other one is probably more where you start looking at things also for their inherent value and not just their monetary value. You know, today, when we talk about agriculture in a conventional way, you know, it's probably more agro-business than agriculture, if I'm honest. You know, everything is just based on, you know, how much money can you make, and you kind of disregard everything that has value too. You know, the value of soil, the value of life, the value of microbes, the value of culture. You know, and there's just so much to it. So biodynamics very much focuses on that too. It makes it a big part out of it. Then it's kind of where you talk about this hocus pocus, where you start losing people a little bit. Biodynamics, you also look at this idea of cosmic rhythms. So you would like to believe that, especially the moon with its gravitational forces being enforced on the earth, waning and waxing moons, new moon, full moon, together with kind of the fixed constellations, the sun and those interactions all essentially play a role in life and plant life. And you take these into account, these fine nuances, you take into account these energies when you farm. And then the last pillar is probably this idea of homeopathic amounts in terms of preparations that you would add to your fields and also to your compost. So that kind of 8 preparations we work with. So the concept on these, I guess, on these two principles is very much that they are governed, especially organics. You know, organics is governed mostly by governments across the world. There are probably kind of 3 main divisions in the sense that the EU has come together and written out certain standards that you need to conform to in order to get organically certified. America has done it under NOP, which is slightly different, and then in Japan you've got JAS, which again has small differences, but mainly they're all very, I guess, very similar. Biodynamics is controlled a little bit differently in the sense that Demeter is the main controlling body. It is not very much written in law like organic is. For example, you could be non-Demeter certified and still call your product Biodynamic. If you don't import it into America, you would import it into Europe. From South Africa, you would be fine. Nobody would stop you. Organic works a little bit differently in the sense that you must be third-party certified in order to call your product organic. So just let's leave it at that and not become too technical about certification. But I think it's just important to note that these are two systems that talk sustainable, that talk regenerative, that talk farming for the next generation. But they are, especially on the organic front, a system that is very controlled. You need to, there's standards. You need to get audited by third-party audit companies, and it's quite strict. When I grew up, and then these things have also evolved. So if you think about it, until 2012, you couldn't actually make organic wine. You could only, because it's such an agricultural-based scenario, you could only make wine made by organic grapes. That's kind of how you had to put it on the label. That has since changed, and there are laws that kind of allow you to do certain things in the cellar and not, which nowadays we can make something called organic wine. Biodynamics has also now got laws and rules in place in order what you're allowed and what you're not allowed to do in the cellar. Again, Demeter, if you want the certification, they will check that you go according to these standards. So to give you a practical idea behind that, if it's organic winemaking, if you want to make an organic wine, you are still allowed to use quite a whole list of additives in winemaking, if you like. To give you an idea, you would be allowed to use commercially cultivated yeast strains. They're just not allowed to be a GMO. On biodynamic winemaking, that would be different. There you would have to use natural fermentations to run your fermentations. Sulfur dioxide additions in winemaking is always a big thing. So again, here you are governed with organic winemaking. You're not allowed to exceed 150 milligrams per liter, which is very much the norm in terms of what you're allowed to do for conventional winemaking. Biodynamics is a little bit stricter here. You're not allowed to exceed values of 100 milligrams per liter. So those are kind of the rules that have come to play here. Natural wine is obviously a completely different concept to this, because it's not so much based on this idea of agriculture. So when I grew up in the wine world, we essentially always viewed, I guess, organic and biodynamic wines in the early days as being natural wines. So when we kind of drank the early, Loire wines and Didier Dagenau's Silex, wasn't so much sold as a biodynamic wine. It was actually sold as a natural wine. And only later we kind of understood more this concept of biodynamic, and people actually started more talking about this concept of this being a biodynamic wine rather than a natural wine. So I think this concept of natural wine is not necessarily something new to us. It's been around for a very long time. And in that, the idea has always been to kind of truly express, I think, this idea of site and terroir without any manipulation in the cellar. This is the one unique thing we have if it comes to winemaking. I call it the holy grail of winemaking, where we have this ability to make a product that is truly unique. The soil, the climate, all of these attributes, and the age of the vine, kind of what you grow, should give you a certain taste in the grape. And obviously that is what you try to put into a form of wine and stabilize it and put it in a bottle in order to show this unique place, this unique site. And these two methods of agriculture, be it organic or biodynamic, I truly believe complement the idea of making truly site-specific wines. And that obviously follows on in the cellar, that you don't want to manipulate so much. You don't want to add, you don't want to change. You really want to rather preserve what the fruit of the grape has got and be able to put that into a bottle. But then over the last, I don't know, it's been more than 10 years, I guess, there's been this phenomenal trend, of natural wine. You mentioned Isabel, I think she really made this global with the raw wine fair, I remember people initially saying, you know, this is just a fad, it's going to disappear, and all of a sudden the fad is a trend, and you know, now all of a sudden we're at a point where this trend looks more mainstream, you know. But it was the new form of natural wine, the way I see it now compared to the, you know, 20 or 30 years ago, does feel a little bit different. You know, it feels to me a lot more kind of, you're trying to break away from rules. You know, winemakers don't want to be boxed or conform to kind of standards written out. You really just kind of want to express what you do as a winemaker. You want to express the vineyard, and it feels quite revolutionary, you know. And I think out of this whole new idea of natural wine has been born. Also, the world's changes, you know, everything has changed. I think young sommeliers have driven this process greatly, you know, this idea of tasting menus and Michelin-starred restaurants, you know, molecular kitchen. These wines made in this very natural way attribute themselves very well to this type of kitchen. So the idea with natural winemaking, as I see it, is no rules at all, but also no intervention, you know. So you're trying to get away from using any sort of additives in the cellar. You are trying to not work with sulfur as a preservative or an antioxidant in the wine at all, you know. Does that kind of give you a bit of an idea, John? Is that what you were looking for? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
I think that's it. The less sense it makes to me.
Well, I think it's a great starting point. There were a number of great points that you made that I hope that we'll get to dig into a little bit further. But one little line that you just threw out as a throwaway was that you know, a shift. You talked about a shift in value, or seeing the inherent value in something as opposed to the monetary value of something. I think that's something that you could probably meditate on for months and months to just figure out how that's going to play out in businesses, in winemaking, in the life of every citizen. But I think that's a very key idea, and I hope that pops up again. But I'm going to shift over to Jamie. Jamie, you're someone who's written extensively on the topic, and so I wanted to get your take on the current state of natural wine. As Rüdiger said, the concepts of organic and biodynamic are pretty ancient. In fact, natural wine in itself, at one stage, every single wine that was made was natural wine. There was no other way to make wine. So it's all very old. And yet it has this kind of feeling of nowness about it, of a newness, of growing, of this burgeoning fad, trend, wave, movement. So Jamie, why do you think this is happening now?
That's a really good question. I think that for me, I first came across natural wine in the early noughties. You know, there were the first sort of discussions about it. You know, of course, its genesis was in the, I guess, would have been in Beaujolais in the 1980s with, you know, Gilles Chauvet was a famous wine scientist. He was the one that experimented vinifying without sulfites in the 1960s. He actually had a small domain in Beaujolais as well. And Chauvet was, you know, I think was what he was reacting against the way that science and technology had muscled into wine growing. And by the 60s, you'd had all sorts of things happening in vineyards and cellars that were, you know, antithetical to making really interesting fine wines. And Chauvet was influential with Lapierre, and Lapierre and a few others got together and started making wines without sulfites, and not just, you know, neglectfully, but actually thoughtfully, and trying to do it the right way, and using microscopes to see what was under, you know, what sort of microbes were growing there. And this is a very thoughtful approach, and the wines that resulted, you know, made a lot of people sit up and notice. But it wasn't until the noughties that the whole natural wine movement started taking off. And I remember in 2011, we had the first natural wine fair in London. At that stage, Isabel was joining in with the other guy, the Real Wine Fair. And then she kind of broke off the next year to launch Raw, and she took Raw global. But throughout Europe, there's always been you know, a natural wine community of people meeting together, having these wine fairs, sharing wines. And this is what's fantastic, I think, about the natural wine community, is that it's an unofficial alliance. It's not a set of rules. And there have recently been attempts to try to produce rules for natural winemaking. Let's define natural wine. Let's get some rules and pin it down. But you know what? I think a lot of that has come from big companies who have seen that there's market traction for natural wine. And they think as long as we've got rules, even though we're putting 25,000 tons through our winery, we'll maybe do 50 tons of natural wine, but according to the rules, and we're making a natural wine. And that's, I think, against the whole spirit of the community, the natural wine community. And, it's, as Rudiger pointed out, everybody's been skeptical. And a lot of my journalist friends have made predictions about this year, natural wine's going to die. It's a fad. And it's not a fad. It may be small and it may be niche, but it's had influence well beyond the niche of what you might define tightly as natural wine. For instance, I did vintage Cristallum in 2018, and I was kind of looking after the whole bunch Pinot Noir. And during the time I was there, 11 days, nothing was added to those wines. The whole bunches were put into the fermentation vats, and we trod them a bit, and then we just let them go. And there's nothing that took place there that you would say is not making natural wine. And this is not a winery that claims to be natural. And I think, look at the Swartland Independent. The whole guidelines of the Swartland Independent are basically a protocol for making natural wine. I think sometimes, though, in the natural wine community, people have got a little bit hung up about sulfites. And what's your sulfite level? That's not the issue. Obviously, initially, the goal with natural wine was to add nothing at all. But it's now accepted that you can be making natural wine as long as you don't add anything, save for small amounts of sulfites, usually at the end before bottling. And any sensible definition of natural wine would allow, in some cases, small additions of sulfites. And I think that that what we're seeing now is maybe we're entering the post-natural wine era. The term natural itself has been a little bit divisive, because people say, well, you're claiming that your wines are natural, therefore you're suggesting that my wines are unnatural. And so there's been this horrible, silly fight. And there's also, I think there's a lot of kickback from techno winemakers and journalists, especially the very well-educated people in the world of wine who basically are affronted by natural wine and dismiss it. And they say, well, the wines are faulty. But inevitably, if you quiz them, they haven't been to natural wine fairs. And they're basing their judgments on an astonishingly small number of encounters with natural wine. And I know one of the most vocal critics of natural wine, I see on his Wines of the Week popping up regularly now, wines that, they're natural wines. Those are natural wines. And so I think there's been a massive transition. We're entering the post-natural wine era, where now I think that the boundaries between natural and conventional, I hate that term as well, are becoming blurred. And I think what we're seeing people making wines without makeup. I think it's a term that's coined by Philip Papato. I love that term, wines without makeup. We've gone through an era where wines were being celebrated, that had loads of stuff added to them. They were extracted, the grapes were picked too late, lots of oak, making big, impressive wines. And even in South Africa today, there's a lot of those wines that are being lauded as great wines, but they're not. They're gross, and they don't speak of their place, and they're clumsy, and they're yesterday's wines, and they're rated highly by yesterday's critics. I think what we're seeing now is this really exciting new generation of people coming up who are celebrating wines without makeup, wines that speak of their place, and wines that have interest and are generally made in a way that you could describe as natural. So, rant over.
I loved what you said. You started off by talking about the community being connected, and later you moved on to rules. And I feel like those two will always work against one another, in a sense that a community will draw people in, but rules will try to keep people in. And I think maybe some of that influence is specifically because of the power of the community that is, the kindred souls, I guess. But Christina, I wanted to ask you a question, given that you half a generation behind Jamie, albeit a kindred spirit of sorts. You would have been in your very early wine journey, I would imagine, when in the noughties. But so has your experience of the natural wine movement been a little different? Have been elements of growth that perhaps Jamie hasn't touched on that you found particularly important?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's ever evolving. I think also in terms of what Jamie was saying, like in coming into this sort of like post-natural wine era, for me, I used the phrase natural wine when I first got into wine and I first fell in love with natural wine. And then I got a lot of criticism from the old guard who were anti-natural wine, so much so that it actually made me stop using the term. And also, I guess, because it's so hard to define it. But nowadays, I've started to use the term again because I think it's pointless if we try to define it. And actually, all that does is make it less inclusive. Whereas I think for the winemaker in question, it's really all about reinterpreting how they work in the vineyards, in the cellars, and then, you know, if they wish to use the terminology natural wine, and if people support their wines natural, then, you know, why not? And I think the most interesting thing for me over the past few years, or probably more so the past year, has been when I first got into natural wine, it was very much, you know, organics, biodynamics, but it's been seeing how many more winemakers are now working according to regenerative agriculture. So the way to look at that really is kind of similar to biodynamics without the anthroposophy element. And it's also really focusing on how we can reduce our carbon emissions, and also how we can start to treat the soil as a carbon sink, with the ultimate aim of becoming carbon negative. So through, you know, many different ways of how to manage your cover crop, I think it's really down to the winemaker where they are and what works for them. And I think the key thing for me with natural farming is that it's using your intuition more, because I feel like in recent years of agriculture, a lot of winemakers just sort of follow almost like a recipe book of, you know, I should be spraying this many times a week or a month, without really going outside and feeling, do I feel like I need to spray? Is it humid? And that for me is what I find really interesting. It's, yeah, figuring out how best to manage your place and experimenting. So for example, there's a grower in Oregon who's really a pioneer at this. His name is Nate Reddy, and the winery is called Hayu, and he's using elements of permaculture. So he's actually he's never used copper because he doesn't have downy mildew problems there, but he's managed to avoid using sulfur in the vineyard for the last 7 years, because he's been using a spray that incorporates like loads of things like fish meal and various plant-based preps, with the aim of creating something that's so full of life and fungal, like healthy, biological activity, that he creates so much life on the grapes themselves, so that there's just simply less space for the mildew. So he's always going to have a tiny amount of mildew, but there's not going to be as much of a problem because there's other stuff to combat the mildew. And it's that kind of thing that I find so interesting. And that's what I love to see more and more. And for me, that is actually more what natural wine is about than if you're just using less sulfites, because I then also think the wine itself is going to be hopefully healthier if you're farming well. But if you just don't change anything in your vineyard and you start to reduce your sulfites, maybe that's not going to work. And that's also, I don't really think that's not really the point. But yeah, I hope that answers the question.
And I loved the phrase, I think you talked about an abundance of life. Isn't that an amazing sentiment to have at the corner of any winemaking philosophy, is to have part of your goal to be an abundance of life in however you want to look at that. So David, can I ask you a question a little bit? Jamie touched on certifications earlier, and, and made some statements about those, and Rudiger was also talking about natural winemaking, almost starting out as an attempt to break away from rules and convention. But then we know that currently, at least, it's largely agreed upon that in order to make a natural wine, you do have to be working with organic vineyards. At least it almost felt like some of the natural winemakers thought, oh, well, maybe we need rules after all. Maybe we need to maintain some order. And perhaps Jamie is right. Perhaps that's all big companies. But that we do now have France's relatively fresh Van Methode Nature certification, and we've got the South African Wine and Spirits Board attempting to develop their own alternative wine category. So I want to know, where do you stand on the need for certifications and regulations? Do you feel that they serve a valid purpose?
Oh, excellent question. And I wish this webinar was longer so I can probably explore that topic much longer, because it's a topic that has no real black or white answer, I don't think, or a yes or no answer. I just want to pick up just a couple of things that that Jamie touched on, and just maybe expand on or add a little bit of perspective or nuance on. It was interesting when the Swartland revolution started, or I should say the Swartland Independent Producers, which is a separate thing, started. They only had one rule guideline about vineyards. It was obviously had to be from the Swartland, but it was only for certain varieties. There was no rules about how those vineyards were farmed. And I think that also one of the really great things about this movement, in South Africa at least, has been its focus away from the cellar and onto the vineyards, onto viticulture. I've been coming here since 2004, I think 2005, moved here full-time in 2013. And over that period of time, the focus of the industry, and therefore all of its all of the shareholders within the industry, right down to the casual drinker, has switched from not only on the cellar, but also including the more holistic picture of the vineyards as well. So, and I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of the guys who aren't making a lot of adjustments in the cellar stay away from the word natural in their marketing or in their explanations of how they make their wines, is because the sources of the grapes aren't necessarily without herbicides a lot of the time. I mean, I think maybe Rudiker or Johan would be better versed on giving the figures on how much of the percentage of the South African vineyard is farmed without herbicides or without pesticides, and I think it'll be a tiny amount. So I think that's something to keep in mind when we're talking about these classifications and these terms. In terms of the need for certification, look, you can't say there's not a need for it, but I absolutely agree with Jamie as well when he said that as soon as you make rules, there'll be people who want to exploit those rules for perhaps nefarious purposes and change what the rules were intended to produce. So, look, I think it is a nebulous topic, and it gives us wine geeks a lot of content to talk about. But in terms of actually talking to people who aren't engaged with wine 40-50 hours a week and only want a really good drink on the weekend or 2-3 days a week, it's a very difficult conversation to have with them, because it's so nuanced, it's so complex. It has to end up with good drinks in the glass, I think. But there are a growing number of consumers who are very concerned with what they put in their bodies, how it was created, how it was farmed. So on that sense, that certification is absolutely necessary. So it's a really sort of stuck in a rock and a hard place in terms of trying to make those two parties correspond or reconcile. Yeah.
I mean, I love what you said about quality is still key. You don't want a wine that tastes healthy. We've all had muffins that taste healthy, and we'd rather not eat them. So we want wines that are excellent, and as you say, can still be good for you in the sense that they're made in a way that respects where they come from.
Yeah, it is a drink after all. It has to taste good.
Yeah. So, just to go back a little bit to natural wine. So it would seem like natural wine as a movement, from what I've been hearing, is something that started in the cellar as a kind of breakaway, trying to rebel against, well, as Jamie said, the way science had muscled in on wine, but also a whole set of kind of rules saying this is what you need to do. And natural wine going, no, we actually want to go back to how it was, in the good old days. But but I loved what Christina said about the fact that there's now the term natural farming, which is a move right out of the cellar and into the vineyards. And you picked up on that as well. And I wanted to ask Johan, because it struck me as that's one of the contrasts between natural and biodynamic, is that natural felt like it started almost as a political statement in the cellar, whereas biodynamics has always been first and foremost about the environment and the human impact on it. So, Johan, I wanted to ask you this because this is something that bothers me often, is when we look back at the development of agriculture over the last 110 years or so, in case you didn't do that in your spare time. Back then, it's kind of after the First World War, as Rudiger was saying, that's when these sort of fertilizers and preservatives first came on the scene. It seems, as far as I can tell, that they were not invented by truly evil people. One might even go so far as to say that they were invented by heroes of their day. They enabled people to seemingly produce more food on less land. And then you had chemicals which could preserve food, which made food safer to eat for a longer period of time, which reduced waste. This seems like a noble goal. So my question to you, Johan, is where did it all go wrong, assuming that it has all gone wrong?
Jono, it's a tough question. I struggle with it daily, to be honest. In my opinion, look, we as people, we've been farming now for 6,000 years at least. And things have changed over this period of time. Nature has become less and people have become more. And I think one could say that initially human beings were threatened by nature, and today nature is being threatened by human beings. So the context has shifted a lot. You don't even have to go back 6,000 years, you can go back 2,000 years. If you go to biblical times, if you open the Bible, Genesis, when you start reading it, it says it there in black and white, you know, this was created, this was created, this was created, and at the end of the day, man was created, you know, as a steward over all of this. So it's a very, what one calls a anthropocentric worldview, a worldview that sees the human being as the primary being in the world, and nature is there for us to use to our benefit. And I think, I agree with you. I think science did amazing stuff. You know, it made it easier to farm vast tracts of land. It reduced risk significantly, and it produced food for an ever-growing human population, and wine for that matter. And I think, you know, in that sense, it was a great thing. But things have changed, and today we've firmly embedded in what is also known as the Anthropocene Age. And what this means is that all our progress, all our scientific endeavors, all our technological breakthroughs have ironically brought us to a point in history where we have the potential to undermine or stop humans on this planet, human life. The impact of man on this planet has become so big that it has the potential to undermine man's existence going forward. So what I take from this is science is, it's amazing. It's a wonderful thing. And you know, I think one would be naive to think that there's no influence of politics or power or money in scientific research. But I think it would be a bridge too far to see this as a sort of a malicious act to destroy the environment and you know, create a harmful methods of agriculture that harms humans and nature. I think what science also tells us, if you look at it differently, is that one of the biggest contributors to global warming and to this predicament in which we find ourselves is agriculture. It's one of the 4 or 5 biggest variables that play into this difficult scenario in which we increasingly find ourselves. And the flip side of that argument is it's also one of the most powerful levers that we have as a human race to get ourselves out of this predicament. So science, nothing for that matter, not just science, but nothing can exist in a vacuum. And the context is important. I mean, there's this old example of a knife, you know, is a knife a good thing or a bad thing? If it's somebody that wants to harm you with a knife, it's a bad thing. If it's a surgeon that's trying to save your life, it's a good thing. And I think that's science. Science is an incredible tool, but I think it's imperative that science and ethics work together. And ethics is also not fixed. It depends on the context. And I think we live in a context where we really need to start thinking about how we employ science to reverse the effects of global warming and all the issues that we face. And one of the biggest things that we can do is regenerative agriculture. And what that means is that we farm in a way that we basically sequestrate carbon on behalf of everybody else on this planet. And we also increase biodiversity in the soil and on the farm. And these are wonderful things. So for me, I think, you know, I never set out to become an organic or a biodynamic farmer. My journey was very different. I studied philosophy. I got a job as a farm laborer, and to work with chemicals on a daily basis sucked. I'll be honest. I wasn't comfortable with working with this stuff. And they have this skull and crossbones on the little packet, and it warns you it causes cancer and stuff. So I think nobody enjoys working with these things. I think we believe we have to work with these things. And it just so happened that in my lifetime, I came across people who farmed organically and biodynamically, and they gave me alternatives methodology that actually worked. I think Jamie made a point about natural wines by design or by neglect, and I couldn't agree more. It's definitely not just about removing the herbicides and the pesticides and the fungicides. That's the tip of the iceberg. The real deal is to understand and to employ a whole different way of farming. And to me, that's the value of organics and biodynamics and regenerative agriculture. And I think if I look, it's funny, you know, biodynamics, you know, it's obviously got this esoteric angle. One can diss it, but I also agree with Christina that, you know, your relationship with your farm is not a purely scientific one. It's also an intuitive one. And the line between intuition and biodynamics is actually a very fine one. So these were methods that worked well, but at no point do I think one should see them as a sort of a silver bullet that will resolve all the issues going forward. And I think we must, you know, just as people before us set out to make the world a better place and to manage risk in agriculture better, and they really try to do their best, one must be cognizant of the fact that here we can also be trying to do our best to farm regeneratively and save nature and save the world, but we could also inadvertently, you know, stuff it up. So dogma never works. I think one must have conviction in your beliefs, but I think one must always keep an open mind and an open ear and try and improve your position as you go along through life. I don't know if that answered your question, John.
No, oh, absolutely. And I think that last point about, you say, you know, I guess to add a cliche, you know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think one of the upsides of systems of rules and frameworks, because we've kind of been tearing rules down a little bit and seeing as some control mechanism, but sometimes rules are put in place by people who've had the experience who have the good intentions and the experience to actually put good frameworks in place that help those who perhaps don't. And so you say keep an open mind. In the same way, I think it doesn't hurt to look at the rules that are in place, and as you say, ask, well, are there good reasons for those rules? And like even with biodynamics, I mean, it was based on the insights of Rudolf Steiner, who was consulted because he was seen to have insights. And what I wanted to do is ask Jamie, as a scientist again. Jamie, can you explain to us some of the logic or the framework behind the biodynamic rules as they exist? Because even though we've been trying to get away from rules and move towards an ethos of taking responsibility for things outside of just yourself, some of us need help. Some of us don't understand how this all works, and we're trying to do our best, but we need to understand the rules. Can you put some order to it for us?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think sometimes people who are opposed to biodynamics like to make it seem more esoteric and strange than it is. And they're usually people who haven't spent much time on farms where people are farming biodynamically. Because, I think, let's strip away the Rudolf Steiner. Understand that Steiner was a strange individual and living in a strange place in time where people, there was some very unpleasant ideas going around at that time. And Steiner was unfortunately caught up in those. And the whole of biodynamics came out of a week long of lectures that he reluctantly gave. And then it took a number of years of people in his institute, then because he died shortly afterwards, then working through and developing a farming system that was based on those lectures. But let's look at biodynamics in practice in wine farms around the world at the moment, and I've seen quite a few of them. Basically, it's principles of good farming, because it's understanding that the reason science went wrong is science didn't have understanding that what we're dealing with is an agro-ecosystem, where all the parts in the vineyard, all the life in the vineyard is interrelated in some way. And you're not just farming grapes, you're not just farming a crop plant, which is the vine stuck in this inert medium, which is the soil. You're farming grapes for sure, but the vine exists within an agro-ecosystem where there are many players. And a lot of what's going on is going on under the soil. And I think science is now beginning to catch up. Science is now understanding, yes, that what happens under the soil, it matters greatly in terms of the way that the vine behaves. And, you can't just ignore this whole concept of agroecosystem. And I think what biodynamics did was well before its time in that sense, in recognizing the interplay between all the different forms of life, and including microbial life in a vineyard or a farm. And so for me, let's forget about some of the more esoteric elements. Let's just look at the way that biodynamics is about farming soils as much as farming the vines. And it's applying principles that, yes, they're often dressed up in a language that does seem very strange and anti-scientific. But if you go to the farms and look at what's in practice, you can say, well, I can see how what's being done here is going to have, a mechanistic effect, explainable by science, which is why so many farmers, so many wine growers have switched from conventional to organics to biodynamics, and with each step along the way have seen an increase in the quality of their grapes and thus the quality of their wines. And so, one example would be induced systemic resistance and systemic acquired resistance. And this is about the vine's ability to fight disease organisms. And some of the sprays that are used in biodynamics, some of the preparations that are then sprayed on the vines, you can see how they, now we know more about the molecular pathways that are involved in inducing this plant resistance, how these different things that are sprayed will be triggering these molecular mechanisms that will be switching on resistance pathways in the vine. And one example again would be like horsetail. So horsetail is something, Equisetum arviense, is a plant that's used to make some of the biodynamic preparations. And horsetail actually has a significant effect if it's you make a preparation from it and spray it in the vines that can be measured scientifically. So Steiner kind of got that one right without, I suspect, really knowing what he was doing. He picked at the Equisetum, and Equisetum has an effect on inducing resistance in plants. So I think there are lots of things that are happening in biodynamics that are scientifically explainable, and biodynamics doesn't require us to leave our scientific principles, and we can integrate, I think, a scientific understanding, a sophisticated scientific understanding of the agroecosystem of a vineyard with the practice of biodynamics. And I'm not saying that everything that's done in biodynamics is going to have an effect, but largely speaking, it's a smart way to farm soils.
I guess what I'm asking in some senses is for farmers who are looking to embrace this, and they may look at something like copper sulfate, and they know that this is highly toxic to humans, whereas something like a glyphosate-based weed killer is not. And yet, when it comes to things like biodynamics and organics, glyphosate is a no-no, but you can spray as much toxic copper sulfate onto your vineyards just days before harvest. I'm trying to understand, for guys who are wanting to practically start to implement these things, how should they be thinking about it when these seeming contradictions exist?
May I add
Well, I think
there as well? I think the key thing there really is figuring out a way to introduce more microbiological activity to the soil through, composting as a key example for that. A winemaker that I know in the Burgenland, he said that the main reason that he wanted to stop using systemics and stop using herbicide was because he had found that one of his vineyards was really sick and the vineyard wasn't taking up magnesium. And he asked some enologists for help, and they said, oh, well, maybe the vineyard is deficient in magnesium. But what actually happened is the vineyard had a lot of magnesium, and the vines weren't able to take this magnesium up, and therefore they were struggling. And the enologist said to him, well, clearly the vine can't take it up, so you should just spray magnesium for the rest of your life. And he was like, that doesn't seem to make sense to me. So the first thing he started to do was to introduce compost, which built up the organic matter in the soil, which actually completely solved the problem. And today the vineyard is alive and kicking and very healthy. So I think that's one of the key things when it comes to understanding the reduction of microbial activity that comes with glyphosate. But sorry, Jamie, carry on.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point, but I was going to say that when it comes to copper, yeah, copper is problematic, copper is toxic, but there are quite strict limits now, and they've just been revised downwards again in the EU about how much copper you can spray. And modern formulations of copper are much more efficient, so that you need to use actually less copper to give protection against downy mildew. Now, in organics and biodynamics, people would love to get rid of copper because it is a heavy metal, and and in the past, heroic doses have been used, and they've caused problems. In the soils that take a while to eradicate. But I think that the thing is really, more broadly speaking, is we need an intelligent approach to viticulture. And some of the rules of organics and biodynamics, yes, they're slightly constraining in terms of, you might want to do something, the best thing. So let me backtrack a bit. What you're doing with viticulture is you've got a range of tools that you can use. And you've got a specific place, and the nature of your site and your place really determines what the most intelligent approach to viticulture is in that place. And there should be certain things that are kind of goals of viticulture, like increasing biodiversity in the vineyard, increasing microbial activity in the soils, because that's really good for the, but also you need to maintain your yields, because yields is money, and without money, you can't farm your vineyard, the vineyard wouldn't exist. So there's lots of things you need to balance out. And I think now we're getting a more sophisticated understanding of the science of what's going on in a vineyard agroecosystem. And it's almost, we need a bespoke approach to each vineyard that says, well, this is good, but it has this side effect. This is good, but it has this side effect. If we do this, this is great, but we will lose yield. And how much yield can we lose? Is that yield loss going to be sustained year on year? And it's almost like thinking about all these different goals and trying to come up with a scientifically sensible answer to the best way of running this particular vineyard in this particular place, because the rules will be different in different places. And that's why I think regenerative agriculture is really exciting, because I think that's more inclusive. It allows a more intelligent approach that really, is based on really good science, and has the ultimate goal, which is to kind of regenerate the soil and the land. And to anyway, that's a very long-winded answer, but it's like it's too simple to say copper's always bad or copper's fine. The answer is much more multifaceted than that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what comes back again to what Christina said about, she mentioned an abundance of life, and it feels like that's what both of you have been touching on, is that it seems like the biodynamic or organic way are various techniques in various contexts, but the end goal is the same, which is to increase biodiversity and especially to increase microbial life. But there will always be abuses of the systems and the certifications, which we touched on. And Christina, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about, less about winemaking, more about communication. And in your work at Little Wine, you guys are on the front line. As you said, you bridge the gap between winemakers and consumers. And in some senses, you play the gatekeeper role of information there. How strongly do you interrogate the producers that you work with on their vineyard practices? And obviously, without naming names, have there been occasions where there are people who are biodynamically certified or organically certified, but who you know are engaging in what would be an abuse of the rules of biodynamism?
Great question. I really do interrogate. So every producer that we put an article up on the site about, or a film or whatever it may be, I interview at length, if not have been to visit once or several times. And I really ask them predominantly about farming and then about winemaking, because I think it's so important. And I also really hope that firstly, the aim of that is so that we can be transparent with the consumers, so they can really learn as much as they want about the wine and know where it comes from, but also so it can serve as like a guide to other winemakers who might be in similar situations. So I mean, the South African to highlight there would be Jochen at Intelego, because what he's been doing has been figuring out how to combat the main enemy of South African vineyards, which is ryegrass, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with. And he's figured out that actually, if you try and manage this ryegrass by using like a weed eater chopping system, too late in the season, it's too late. Your yield's already way too low. So he's doing that much earlier. And that's sort of been like a several year journey of discovery to figure out how to do that by using straw and, by trying to quash the life of the ryegrass and these cutting machines. So I hope that by communicating that, maybe someone somewhere else in the world who has some kind of weed that's a problem can then interpret that. And I mean, back to the question of if we've had any issues, thankfully, touch wood, no. But there have been instances in Europe and further afield where there has been some kind of lie that's been going on, whether it's been, someone that's gone back on their word, or I think the key thing really as well is looking at labor. So there's been an instance recently in Italy whereby a vineyard who say they practice biodynamic principles have been hiring people illegally and paying them like a complete pittance. And that's also a key part of biodynamics and regenerative. There's a new regenerative certification called Regen Organic Alliance. And built into that is also how you treat your workers, and are they paid fairly? Do they lead good lives? And that's really a key thing. So I try to always ask that question as well, which can be an awkward question to ask because it can sound like you don't trust someone. But I do think these questions do need to be asked, and that plays a really big part of it too. So yeah, thankfully, I feel like my questioning means that everyone that we feature is true to their word, and then it's really a trust game, and I trust them. So yeah.
No, and that's amazing. And I loved what you said about treatment of humans. And in fact, I've chatted to Johan a little bit, and I want to get his take on this now, because this issue is more real for South Africans than anyone else, in the sense that South Africa as a country has the highest Gini coefficient in the world. Put another way, that means that the gap between the rich and the poor is never bigger than in South Africa. And even more so, Stellenbosch is seemingly, or the wine industry at large is seemingly an even more concentrated continuation of the same level of inequality. And if we look at organics as a movement, I mean, largely it's seen as a kind of, elitist first world, or solution to an elitist first world problem that has no regard for the poor because of the cost of food that you have to pay for. So my question, Johan, to you is biodynamics seems to be about being self-sustaining and about being a system that works on its own. And I want to ask you, where do the humans fit into your philosophy of biodynamics? And I'm happy for you to talk from your personal perspective, because if a system is to be truly sustainable, by the way I understand it, it needs to protect all the vulnerable parties, whether those parties are delicate ecosystems or destitute human beings. Can you continue on what Christina was saying and speak to that point?
I can. It's interesting to hear what Christina said. This last two certifications, I wasn't aware of this incidence, but I could see that our certification bodies were much more rigorous in checking basically worker remuneration and the lives our workers lead on the farm. And in the past, I thought it was all about organics and biodynamics, but the CSR component has really been stepped up over the last two vintages. But I actually want to take it back to something that Jamie said, and it's this idea of, what does sustainability mean in itself? It can't be just about nature. And I agree with it. In my view, sustainability is a three-legged chair. You have to look after nature. You have to look after people. But you also have to look after money. And if you don't look after those three areas of your business, sooner or later, the chair will fall over. Unfortunately, it seems as if one can exploit nature the longest, people the second longest, but the moment you run out of money, you're out of business. So that variable carries a lot of weight, and people must be aware to that. But I think, Jono, it goes without saying, man, I think anybody, why do people want to farm organically, or why do people want to make natural wine, or why do people want to make biodynamic wine? I think if you're a cynic, you can say that they do it for marketing purposes, but I think people will see through your product very quickly if you're organic or biodynamic or natural from a marketing point of view. I think what it is it boils down to respect and almost empathy or awareness for the natural environment in which one lives. And I think, that same type of person will also have respect and empathy for the people that they work with on a daily basis. And I think it's crucial. It's not even negotiable. And I think specifically in a country like South Africa with a history like apartheid and a massive Gini coefficient, even more so. So I saw in the last couple of the days, the News just released a wine where they've given equity to their staff, and the staff is on the directorship of this new brand. And I think this is just amazing. It's fantastic. And there are a number of such initiatives in South Africa that have happened and is still happening. And unfortunately, you will also have people who couldn't give two hoots about the people who work for them or about the natural environment in which they live. And I think that's not a problem unique to South Africa. I think you'll find people all over the world like that. But I think those of us on the panel, the people who are attending the seminar, are generally looking for something more, are looking for something, with a bit of integrity and a bit of value. And I always say to people, one of my favorite quotes comes out of that book, Life of Pi. When that little boy walks to school, he walks through the arch. And on the arch, it says, Nil magnum nisi bonum. There can be no greatness without goodness. And I really believe that. Our times on this planet is finite. We're not going to live forever. We're not here just to become successful and make money and then die. If that was the case, it would be very sad. I believe, there's more to it. And I really believe we're all driven people, all of us, or most of us. And I just think with that drive must also come integrity. And one must not, exploit nature or exploit people to get to your goals. I think you might still get there, but it'll be a sort of a hollow victory once you reach the finish line. And in quite, to tell you honestly, we've had a lot of trouble on our farm with COVID and not being able to sell wine and markets taking a lot of headwind from all over the world, and particularly in South Africa with the lockdowns and stuff. And some days, if you look at the numbers, you know, you want to pull the hair out of your head. You're just like, what have I signed up for? You know, why am I still here? What am I doing? But if you go for a walk on the farm and you see the people who work there, and you see just the rapport you have with the people, and you see all the people that are employed by the business, and you see a grysbokkie, a little buck running across, or you see a porcupine in the afternoon stroll, or a jackal buzzard flying ahead. Those things, to me, personally speaking, carry me through difficult times, much more than any hunger for money or success ever will. Yeah, so to me, it's a no-brainer. I think if you're serious about respecting the environment, you must definitely also respect people.
Jono, I've got a question for Johan. Can I ask that or not?
Yeah, bring it on.
Yeah, cool. I mean, we've been talking about sustainability, and obviously when people talk about sustainability, they mostly think about sort of ecological sustainability, but as you say, there is social sustainability and financial sustainability. Is it sustainable for an industry to farm this way, or is it always going to be a niche item within the broad scope of wine production or grape production?
David, I think it's an excellent question. Two things. One thing is that people must understand that a third of the food that we produce on this planet is thrown away, literally as waste. So this idea that agricultural production must be high for the sake of humanity is sometimes somewhat misplaced. I think it's a distribution and a cold chain and a logistical problem as well. And to neglect those part of life and to sort of put pressure on farmers to exploit nature further to improve their yields is looking for answers in the wrong place, if I can call it that way. The second thing I want to say is, you know, we've been applying these methods for 20 years now. And in the beginning, it was very difficult. In the area where I farm, if you farm conventionally, you're going to get about 8 to 10 tons per hectare. And I dropped right down to about 2 or 3 tons per hectare. And if that happens, like Jamie says, you're out of business, because you lose the farm, you lose the dream, the people and the nature and everything that lives there also lose the dream. But what has happened was, and this was something that people have to believe in, people who are keen to follow this path, they must have a bit of faith. I was told many years ago that there's a correlation between soil health and plant health. And if you could build the humus levels in your soil, they would significantly improve the resilience of your plants. And the figures they gave us was, if we could increase our humus levels in our soil to 5%, the resilience of the plants that live there would increase by as much as 300%. Now, that was a very tall order, because, as you know, we farm in some of the oldest and most extensively weathered soils in the world. And when we started and we analyzed, we were at about 0.5, 0.7%. And today, if we're really lucky, we can find pockets with about 4.3%. But what I have seen is that our yields have now normalized. It's been a hell of a long time, and I'll give you that. It's been 20 years of this. I don't think it would have taken 20 years. I think there was also a bit of organic by neglect and not by design. And I think we understand things a lot better now than we did in the past. But over the last 2 seasons, I've been pulling off yields, some blocks 7 tons, some blocks 9 tons this year as well. Much higher than the 5 to 6 ton per hectare target that I set myself. But in truthfulness, the farm did first go through a dip, and then it recovered. And I'm very grateful for the place where we are, because now we can farm without all the assistance and all the external inputs and generate sustainable yields. But if you look next door, we also invested in a farm in 2015, and that farm last year had great yields, and this year almost half the yields. And you can see it clearly. It's amazing. The farm and the soil and the life in that farm hasn't developed nearly to the same extent as the portion that we've been farming in this way for 20 years. And as a consequence, the vines and the plants that grow there are a lot more vulnerable. So yes, I do think this is possible for all of us to do. And I don't think that the world will run out of food if people farm in a regenerative way. But I do think that people must be circumspect and have their eyes wide open when they go into this game. And my advice is always to start small, make your mistakes on a small area. And then when you get that right, you know, increase it, a bit like chucking a pebble in the pond. But even with 20 years experience, we've converted the farm next door 5 years ago, and we could already see how much more vulnerable it was this season compared to the farm that we've been building up for 20 years.
Yeah, I've got a follow-up question. If you weren't, sorry, Jono, if I'm overstepping my my remit here. If you weren't having to certify yourself as biodynamic, could have you shortened that time? In terms of the dip, or would there be if you start with the end in mind rather than the journey of certification being a necessary part of the journey, would you be able to make that happen quicker, i.e. have less financial risk?
So I've got mixed feelings about that. As much as I detest certification, and I really do, it's the bane of my existence. It's 3 days every year of pulling out the hair in your head, doing admin, which I absolutely hate, getting everybody on the farm to do admin when we've got much more important work to do on the farm, paying a small fortune over to the certification bodies. In our case, I'll put a figure to it. You're looking easily at $100,000 a year. I would much, much, much rather take that money and give it to the people who work on the farm and give it to some multinational European certification body. But I'm still certified, and I'm still certified for 2 reasons. Initially, I actually learned a lot. I thought I was organic and I thought I was biodynamic until I actually had to get certified. I can remember I went with my truck and I bought a whole bunch of animal manure and spread them in my Cabernet because I didn't want to use artificial fertilizer. And when the certification body came, they said, but where did the manure come from? And I said, no, I went to this pig farm in this place, so and so and so. And they said, but how did those pigs live? What were they fed? What were their living conditions? And I never actually thought about it like that. And other small stuff that really, you know, if I look at couch grass, squirk, for example, I'm taking it out by hand at the moment, by fork. It's going to cost me probably 50, 60,000 rands to do it. I could have sprayed it with Roundup for $5,000. Every morning I wake up, I'm like, yes, maybe I can just do it once. But because it's not what I signed up for, and it's not what I believe in, and it's not what I stand for. The other thing, David, is there is an incredible amount of greenwashing going on. Unfortunately, people are desperate to sell their product. And just like I will embroider and embolden whatever I do with my wine and try and tell people how fantastic it is, how organic and biodynamic and all the nice things we do on the farm and how we love our workers. Everybody else tries to do the same thing because we all need to make a buck, you know, and we're passionate and we want to share that story, but some people just cannot help to cross the line. And there is a lot of greenwashing, and I've been in chats and I've been visited with journalists, with other producers that I can remember walking in New York a while ago and seeing biodynamic labels on South African wines that I knew for a fact used herbicides and all kinds of things in their vineyards. And I asked the oak in New York, what's going on? He's like, no, I visited the guy and he told me he was organic and biodynamic. And So I think certification still has a role to play. But I get that it's contentious, and this is probably very late in this discussion to mention it, because we've got to wrap it up. But I loved, on the other side, you know, Jamie's idea of a community, and that we don't need rules, and we don't want to over-regulate this and kill it and push it in a box and take its personality away. But I'm just, from personal experience, I'm wary of people there. There's a lot of good people out there, but there's also a lot of bullshit out there as well.
Can I just to finish off with a question, I guess slightly more industry-oriented question, but Rudiger, I just wanted to ask you off the back of that, especially what Johan was saying about starting small. You're head of production for Vinimark and some of their associated producers, which includes Reinica. But for some of the producers, you are required to make some large volumes. Now, eternal optimist aside, can you say that you feel biodynamic principles and regenerative farming, do you feel that they are truly scalable, or are they always going to be linked or part of the domain of craft or artisanal wine? Rudiger?
Can you hear me? Jono, let me maybe put it differently. You're right, you know, I sometimes I see it as being fortunate, other times maybe less fortunate, but I do move around in the wine industry that it's kind of a yin-yang situation at times, you know. Sometimes I sit in Robertson, you know, which is a real wine factory, and we make certain decisions, and we make certain wines based on, you know, 34 growers spanning over 2,500 hectares of vineyards, and a reality of, you know, millions of liters of wine that needs to get first met Johan, I started, you know, I grew up drinking unbelievable wine when I first entered the wine industry in my early days working with Marketbook and Houtskloot. You know, we were very privileged. The best wines of the world at those, or what we considered those years, the best wines of the world, were still affordable. So we drank quite a few of those. God, sometimes we even cooked with them, you know. But I remember the most interesting ones I always tasted, the ones I enjoyed drinking the most expressive ones, the most honest wines, were kind of grown in a more regenerative or natural or biodynamic way. You know, that's how I knocked on Johan's door in 2004. You know, I wanted to understand what is this thing called biodynamics. And Johan at that stage was pretty much the only guy in South Africa doing biodynamic viticulture. And I think everybody put it across very, very cleverly today. This system really works in the diversity of nature. You know, nature finds its stability in diversity. It's this concept of holism, very much like Jamie pointed out earlier. You know, everything is connected. Everything relies on each other, you know, and if you can create a system where that works, that's why I think this word herbicide always pops up so much. You know, the worst thing you can use is a herbicide. You know, it really is even worse than a systemic spray. Herbicide is broad-based. It's a little bit like an antibiotic, you know. It kills everything, you know. So once you try to, you put this glyphosate or Roundup spray down on your soil to kind of get away from the ryegrass, it doesn't just kill everything that's there in terms of grass. It also kills everything that's underneath the soil in terms of the microbes. And Jamie is right, you know, we're only really starting to understand now how important these microbes is, this diversity of the microbes is. And that essentially lends us then to make these natural wines, you know. So to give you just a very practical example, at Reinica, you know, we've become quite a big, you know, we farm now 120 hectares of land biodynamically, of which 60 hectares is farmed under vineyard. You know, that's that's a big vineyard, you know, and it is farmed biodynamically. You know, all of these grapes are fermented naturally, and we don't have any fermentation issues. Now, there's a reason for that. You know, that doesn't just happen. The reason for that is this idea of holism enables, in this diversity and in this natural way that plant can grow without being hindered or being diseased or being held back, gives us the ability to form all sorts of other molecular and biological structures. So the amino acids, for example, are in a completely different form, the proteins, in grapes that are farmed in an environment where nothing has been poisoned as such, you know. So and there's a lot more diversity. So Johan will know this better. We at the University of Stellenbosch out looking at microbe diversity in our vineyards compared to our neighbors. And the reality is it's not double or 3 times, it's 1,000-fold more. You know, that's how extreme it is. So all of a sudden you run a natural fermentation. There's so much different activity. It's not just one strain, you know, it's multiples, it mutates, it changes, it's dynamic. And this way of farming enables that. That's why you can run these natural fermentations. To give you a practical example, again, in university in the wine books, we learned, now that we're on the topic of nitrogen and fermentations, that you need to have a YAN amount, which is yeast assimilable nitrogen. So essentially the nitrogen that is available for the yeast to take out of the grape must naturally occurring, of at least 180 units. If it's below that, you're going to have a stuck fermentation. It's not going to happen. Then what you need to do is you will have to add a nitrogen source to the ferment, and most of the time you do that with diammonium phosphate, you know, which is stupid because you're adding a phosphate to something, you know, it's not very smart. But then you're adding a nitrogen source into your ferment that your yeast can take up. At Reinicke, you know, we're running ferments sometimes with YANs as low as 90, you know, so the textbooks say that's absolutely impossible, but it isn't, you know, because the yeast has the ability to break down just about all of those proteins, those amino acids, down to the point to extract all the nitrogen it needs to run the fermentation. Or maybe it's an inherent yeast that doesn't need so much nitrogen. Because that's the problem with this really hard conventional thing, you know, you kill everything to begin with, and then you need to build up. So every time you add something, there's another consequence. You need to add something else, and before you know it, you know, you're building a wine and you're not making a wine anymore. So an inoculated yeast, you know, a commercially cultivated yeast strain, which are mostly hybrid yeasts that then get freeze-dried. You know, these guys are built up in a yeast factory on normally an energy source like molasses. That molasses is normally as cheap as chips, so there'll be a whole lot of sulfur in that molasses. So all of a sudden, this inoculum of yeast you build up is used to sulfur dioxide. At the same time, they chuck in a whole lot of ammonia onto this molasses in order to get this inoculum to grow as quickly as possible and as big as possible. Now it's huge. Now you can kind of clean it up and freeze-dry it and then sell it to a winemaker in a little packet, like yeast for baking bread, and you're going to add it to your ferment to ferment your juice, and you must. But this yeast, you know, it's been raised essentially on McDonald's burgers, you know, that's all it bloody hell knows. So it's not going to break down intricate kind of proteins and amino acids for its need for this high energy food, you know. So now all of a sudden you need to add ammonia, or you need to add DAP in order to keep it going, to finish the fermentation, you know. Then it spits out, and then it's not, you know, it knows sulfur, you know. So in order to kind of stabilize this thing, you can't just add 20 or 30 parts of sulfur just before bottling to preserve this product and put it in the bottle. Now, God, now you need to have 150 parts, you know, because half the compounds that are being formed during the metabolic processes, you know, they all will bind sulfur, you know, there'll be so much acetaldehyde that hasn't fermented through to ethanol, you know. So it's one of these things. I guess what I'm trying to say is this is not something you can't be half pregnant with this thing, you know. It doesn't work like that. It is something you, like Johan rightly says, it can be done. It just takes it's more than just doing it. You need to believe it first and foremost. You need to have the aptitude to see it through, and you need to live it. You know, it's not something you do today from 8 to 5, and then you go home and you know, and then you have a completely different lifestyle at home. It is something you engage with, you live with. It's a lifestyle, and I think if that happens, you know, so if I could convince our 34 grape growers in Robertson, spanning over 2,000 hectares of vineyards, and I could press a button and overnight, you know, they believe this, because you mustn't forget, they've never farmed like this before. They hear the stories, but their parents have told them very differently to farm. You know, that's how they learned it at college and varsity. You know, that's how the Hufsmos tells them what they need to do. You know, it's just not worth the risk, really. But I do believe it's possible to be done on big scale. But you know, if your heart isn't in it, if your soul isn't in it, then you've got no chance in hell, if that answers your question. So I do believe currently that's why you mostly just see it very much in this kind of artisanal space. But look at Chile, you know, Emilia, I think they've got 600 hectares biodynamically certified. That's huge, you know. Chaputia, you know, pretty much all of his vineyards across all of the properties are now biodynamically certified. You know, that's a few hundred hectares of vineyards. You know,
it feels like
I do believe it can be done, but it's you need to be pregnant, you know, to have a baby. You can't be half pregnant.
So it feels like you're saying if the system is in place, there's no limit to its scale.
Very much the system, and then obviously the whole being. You know, you need to, as I said, you need to live it. It is a lifestyle. It's more than just a system.
Thank you. So we're coming to the end now. We're 27 minutes over time, but it's been a fascinating chat. I really wanted to just hear from the panel before we end off, if there are comments or threads that perhaps got skipped over. I noticed that the people who have been with us have stayed with us. And I think it would be a shame to lose, to lose those threads or ideas to save a couple of minutes. So to the panel, are there any thoughts or ideas that you perhaps feel we just still need to touch on before we end?
Just a very small point, and sorry, zooming out a little bit rather than getting too micro. I think, and I'm happy for any of the panel members to jump in and tell me I'm talking absolute codswallop, to say it nicely. We talk about in this space the producers rather than wine by wine. So we talk about a biodynamic producer or a natural producer or organic producer. So we don't talk about Johan makes a biodynamic wine. He's a biodynamic wine producer, and I think it's a key difference in the thought process and where you start about even sort of thinking about this sort of side of wine production, that it is, as Rudiger said, an all or nothing approach. You can't sort of be half pregnant or half organic or semi biodynamic. It is you either are or you aren't in some sense. But then again, that gets into the certification argument. But it is the word holistic's been bandied around a lot today, but there's a reason for that, because it is intrinsic on the whole subject that it has to have part of all of the whole involved. So just wanted to put a little planted flag on that.
Is there anyone who wants to respond to that? No? Great. Well, then I think we will put a fork in that to end there. But I wanted to thank you guys as a panel for your time and your insight. Christina, Jamie, Johan, Rudiger, David, my mind is expanded to the point of discomfort, I think. And just some of the things that we touched on, which I found particularly poignant, was, Johan, you talked about a shift in balance right? There was a time when humans needed to be protected against nature, but now that has shifted. And I think that's really important for farmers to acknowledge, is that we're living in a different era where actually humans need to protect nature. And I love what Rudiger talked about a shift in the idea of value. It's not a profit. And to quote Howard Schultz from Starbucks, you know, the 3 Ps, people, profit, and planet. I think that's something that we need to see grow into the wine industry, touching on all of those bases. And to what Jamie said, like, biodynamic farming is not weird. It actually is, it makes total sense, and it will touch on those if you get fully pregnant, to mix metaphors here. But I think these ideas are so important. And then that at the end of it, if the wine is terrible, then what are we all doing here? So I think that the big challenge is to be aware of the shift in our relationship with nature, to be aware that there is another way of quantifying value, but also to be aware that we're still trying to make great wines. And I think that is an enormous challenge. And I just want to thank you guys for framing that, for sharing your expertise and giving of your time. So to the guys who've stuck with us and are still at home, if you enjoyed this discussion, it's not the only one we've done. There's plenty more on the Vidimark website. And in a follow-up to this, there will also be a podcast where I chat to Rudiger a little bit more about some of the topics that we touched on in this webinar. So thank you for sticking with us, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon.